Raymond Olais will do a presentation just shortly. Let me read his bio. Raymond Olais retired in 2018 after having taught art for 25 years at Newton High School. Born and raised in California, Raymond came to Kansas in 1978 after meeting his wife Patrice while they were both attending the San Francisco Art Institute. Patrice asked him to help her paint a mural to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Mexican-American men's fast pitch tournament held annually in Newton. If you've not gone, make plans to go this coming. It's a great, great event. In Newton, her hometown, which picked Raymond's early interest in the history of Newton's Mexican community and their relationship with the Santa Fe Railroad. Raymond began documenting more in depth Newton's Mexican community in the 1990s while serving on the Newton Fiesta Committee, curating a historical display of stories and photos annually. He published numerous stories about the community and has given historical presentations in Newton and surrounding communities throughout the years. Finally, coming full circle, his ties to the 4th of July Fast Pitch Tournament include publishing historical booklets, designing t-shirts, and artwork promoting the annual event, which celebrated its 76th anniversary this past July. Thank you, J.P. Wigan and Sons, for sponsoring his presentation. Please give a warm welcome to Raymond Olais.
All right, I'm a shorty here, so I gotta pull this mic down. So this is the mural that we painted when I came here, and I knew nothing really of the history of Newton's history. In fact, let me go to the next slide. Here we are, here I am without gray hair, and college students, and when I met Patrice, and she told me she was from Kansas, I was like surprised because I did not think there were Mexicans in Kansas. I was truly surprised because I thought they were only in the Southwest. So then, we became good friends, and the next thing you know, she's saying, well, you know what, we're both painting majors. She had this wild idea to paint a mural to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the ball tournament. And so when I came to Newton, it was a real eye-opener. I had to learn all this history. But when I'm painting this mural, now I'm going to go back to it. Now when we're painting this mural, we only had like 1 month to kind of combine all the imagery. And I had to depend on the people of the community, especially her parents. I said, "Oh, you need to put this picture in. You need to put this in here. You need to put that in here." And I'm like, "Whoa, wait a minute, what is this about?" Like the old church, you got to get a ball player in there. You got to talk about the old fiestas. You got to talk about the dancing, the food, the old ranchitos. So that was kind of the start of it, but I was no authority on it, and just painted it, but it always was in the back of my mind. So this was in 1978, and so the murals hung at the ballpark for a few years, and then eventually the ballpark closed, and I gained possession of the mural. And I just kind of did a color overlay of it on the newspaper article. Just to kind of give you an idea of what it looked like when it was at the ballpark. And then, since I'm going to talk about the Ranchitos, that got started in the 90s, just as the gentleman mentioned. But we started with the Newton Fiestas, and what happened with the Fiestas is that we wanted to actually add a little more element. We're going to have mariachis, or we're going to have dancing, we're going to have just a bit food, all those kind of entertainments that happen at a Mexican fiesta. The one thing I did want was that I didn't want any jalapeno eating contest. I said, you know what, instead of doing a jalapeno eating contest, let's do a historical show. And the one thing that piqued my interest was this photo right here. Because this gentleman back there was my wife's grandfather. And when I saw that photo, I said, are there more photos like this of Newton's bands at that time? And this was like a band in the 1920s. And so we went searching. So we had that whole year of planning for the fiesta, the September 16th fiesta, and we found like 12 different photos from 1920 to 1960, or 1970 actually. And so we got them, we collected them, we matted them, framed them, and we hung them at the church, actually Our Lady of Guadalupe. And then the next year, I said, okay, now what are we going to research and look for? So then that became the Ranchito. So right here was the Ranchito. And then later we did working on the railroad, the sports, the top left you can see. So every year we did a different part. But so I'm going to continue with the Ranchito because that's kind of how it got interesting. So that became my way of discovering those images that I had painted in the mural. I go, okay, now I get to understand them even more. Why did I paint them and what were they about? So why did they have the ranchitos? Well, you had railroad workers that came to Kansas. The Santa Fe recruited them and said, you need to come here and work because there's not any, they were having a hard time getting recruitments and needing the help laying the railroad. So, and yeah, I know initially you see the stories about the Chinese workers from the West Coast, the Italian workers from the East Coast. Well, that was too far away from home for them. So the railroad realized that if they went down to El Paso, they had a railroad that connected to the American railroad, and from there, it was easy to recruit. Because what they did is they just went to the Mexican side and said, hey, you guys are being paid 50 cents a day. How would you like to get paid $1 a day? So the Mexicans were easily recruited. And then this is just a one of the kind of like the postcard or a flyer that was put out advertising necesitamos trabajadores mexicanos para el campo. So they're looking for Mexican workers to work in the camps. They're looking for workers in Illinois, the Yarda of Chicago, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, Wyoming, Montana, other places. They don't have Kansas here, but you'll notice that the office is in Kansas City. And then when the Mexicans first appeared in Newton, they first appeared in 1905. A newspaper article stated that a carload of Mexicans were sidetracked at the station a couple hours this morning. And then here's what, they're not so politically correct, right? The greasers were from El Paso and were on their way to Florence where they will labor on the double tracking job. The greasers seemed to have a fondness for watermelons, and Joanna Werner sold out her supply of melons to them in short order. The greasers were working at Arc City and a few weeks ago.
Where does the name greaser come from? What does it mean?
Well, it's a derogatory term, just like any other terms from way back when things weren't politically correct. Greasers was like from the food that they made, the refried beans, which they still make to this day. So here's an early photo of the workers that came. One of the earliest ones that I have, a section gang of Newton taken around 1904. The Terrones family, I acquired this photo from Alfred Terrones, and it just shows you the crews that were here. Now they didn't always necessarily come right away. They would come and work, and they could have actually just been living in little shanties. They put up their own little tents, very crude homes that they had at the time. But they kept coming. So here's one where they come in 1919. The Jaso family, I don't know if any of you remember the old La Tapatia family. Well, that was the Jaso family that ran that, and that was related to the Jasos here. But here they were when they first came to Newton, the father and son. They came here to visit a sister, and then from there they ended up saying, "Hey, you know what? The railroad's hiring. Let's stay here and see what happens." And then they've now been here almost at least 100 years. And then once again another gang in the 30s on the tracks, and I just find these fascinating because these photos were taken, you know, once again almost 100 years ago. So they had that. I mean, there's that rare time to find such a gem of a photograph of them taking a break and on the track out on the job in their overalls. You know, just that camaraderie that they had working on the job. And then once again, here they are, 1940, a Sand Creek crew, predominantly Mexican workers from Newton. And so they're by now probably living at the camp, almost all of them. And if not at the camp, then very close proximity to the camp. And then one other one, Mr. Pedrosa and Mr. Hassel, once again, a little older in 1934, just taking a break on the tracks. But once again, a very rare photo of that time. So to me, I'm considered a historian, but really there are some great historians besides me out there. And to me, one of them is Father William Schaefer. He's the first historian of Newton's Ranchito, because at the Ranchito was also his church. So he took these photos. This is his photo album that describes the ranchitos, the very first ranchito, not the ranchito on First Street, but the ranchito that, oops, he told me about that. He told me this will zoom past everything. There it is. So this was just one of the pages of his album, just talking about the children in their Sunday best, his Avenue A, his Little Mexico. There's a procession of Corpus Christi. Just talking about what it was like in Newton at the camp in 1920. And there's that vehicle that gives you an idea how long ago it was. There's the church that was the center point of the Ranchito, where the very devout Catholics of the railroad camp spent their time on the Sunday afternoons and in any other religious event. And then the railroad planned housing for the workers. And I'm going to read this one because this one gets a little long. In 1911, the Santa Fe designed plans to build section houses in Newton so the men could live with their families. The section houses were made from scrap or second-hand materials and were built by the men themselves. The Santa Fe designed two types of houses for the Mexican worker. The first camp in Newton was cheaply constructed, which would not be seen by passengers on the main line. The plan for the inconspicuous section houses were erected on the branch lines and would have rails for the rafters, sewer pipes for the chimney, and sometimes a concrete floor, though usually it was only dirt. There was no water, electricity, or inside toilet, and the only heat was from a stove. So this is so the railroad realized they had to construct those homes. They couldn't just rely on the men having their own shanties on the side of the tracks. And then these are Father Schaefer's photographs of those shanties that the section houses that they built, and he called them his Avenue A, B, and C. You can see how the houses were built with the ties just standing up. And then just another one, what he called his Little Mexico, one of the views even closer. And he talks about this, in these little homes, I offered masses to my parishioners. Parishioners of about 70 families eventually. Then the procession carrying the Blessed Sacrament, the children in their Sunday best, the Feast of Corpus Christi. These are just blow-ups, bigger of the album that I showed you earlier. And I love the bottom line there. Flower girls at attention, poor but innocent. And then once again, flower girls, just a little more, blow up, just a little bigger image, so what I showed earlier. And then, second Ranchito, the aerial view. And this was actually by chance, by happenstance, that they caught the Ranchito, because they were actually just worried about the other images on top, the other buildings on top. So I have this great, this was built in the 1920s. Brick section houses in Newton accommodated up to 20 families, called the Ranchito by the laborers, and Ranchito means little ranch. These sections were slightly better constructions than would be viewed by passengers passing on the main line. In other words, the railroad realized that, well, wait a minute, we're going to have passengers driving by on the trains, we should have our employees having better looking houses than those previous shanties. So they ended up building these brick units. So I have this remembrance from Gilbert Sandate, who lived in these homes. And he sent me these stories about it. And I just want to share them to you because they're just so profound. The workers and their families received subsidized housing in these tenements, but paid for utilities such as water and later gas and electricity. I say later because for many years there was no electricity or gas. Thus, no lights, heat, or refrigeration. We made do with kerosene lamps and candles for light, and wood and coal-burning pot-bellied stoves for heating and cooking. In the wintertime, the bitter Kansas temperatures made it difficult to provide sufficient heat throughout the tenement with the pot-bellied stove. The concrete floors and walls would absorb the cold outside temperatures, thus offsetting the paltry heat from the stove. So layers of clothing for each of us was the norm. Refrigeration to keep food from spoiling consisted of ice boxes that were loaded with chunks of ice in a bottom compartment that lasted for several days. This was a challenge in the summer months as the ice melted quickly, requiring continual replenishing in order to keep perishables fresh. There was also a one-room public health clinic built at the camp, staffed by a lone nurse, Miss Thomas, who made monthly trips to examine residents for minor ailments, take temperatures, record weights, and provide inoculations. And then another one of the historians was Mr. Chris Palacios. He had a family that was in Matfield Green and in Florence. And actually you can go to Florence and in their historical museum, they actually have one room dedicated to all the historical stuff that Chris Palacios put together because he lived there. But this is the one that he also came and lived here in Newton. And so this is his drawing of the property at Our Lady of Guadalupe, the first one, and then the two ranchitos. There was one on First Street, and then two that went back to the back of the camp. So a pretty big size camp, considering the number of workers that they had in Newton. And there's the tank that was just recently torn down, and then they just replaced it. And then just a great interior view of the little church. Once again, the central focal point of the community. Built the church for Mexicans in Newton in the spring of 1920. My Mexican parish counted about 76 families. And it's a Christmas time image because on the left-hand side of the photo, you can see the Christmas tree there. And the one little pot-belly stove. And then a great outside view and one of the first lowriders in Newton. And then just some great photos of of the kids of the church, of the community from the Ranchito, kind of dressed up in their Sunday best. And then he talked about, Mr. Sandate talked about how they came in and gave inoculations to the kids. So here's one, Dr. Knowles, assisted by his nurse, vaccinating Mexican children during a visit to the Mexican camp. Miss Joe Conway was once again one of those social workers that came to the camp. Now you can see the brick units behind them. So this is the newer ranchito that they're at. And then this is the one building that was the baby clinic that he also talked about, that they came and helped the women take care of the babies, record their weight, help give inoculations, and just try to give them general health information. And then Miss Lucille Thomas, registered nurse with one of the ladies of the camp, and she's probably one of the most revered ladies of the camp because she was always there helping the community out. And I want to say, let me just read a little bit about this part about that once again Mr. Sandate wrote about. Not to say that the living conditions at the ranchito were great, because they weren't. In addition to the lack of electricity, the tenements had no indoor running water or toilets. Our water source was a community outside pump located in the middle of the community of tenants for all to share. Thus, we would take our 10-gallon lead water pails to the pump and fill them up, then carry them home to our tenement. That water was then used for cooking, drinking, washing face and hands, and partial body cleansing as best one could until it was time for a weekly bath or shower. There was one community shower per every 6 tenement units. The shower had a water tank that stored cold water, cold water only, so cold water showers were the norm. If one wanted the luxury of a hot or warm water, a small fire had to be built under the water tank and stoked for a considerable amount of time, just to get the briefest of warm water for a quick shower. Baths for the smaller children consisted of an open-air wash tub, or tina, and tina is the Spanish word for a tub, filled with water that the children could splash around in and be washed by older siblings or their parents. And then just another great view of the camp, one of the brick units, and just an informal family portrait of a grandmother and their daughter and the granddaughters. And you can see the condition of the brick units. They're very well built and very simple, but very well maintained by the community. And then there was times when they did the informal portraits there. This was one of the baseball teams that came out of it. This was in 1932. This was the Cuauhtemocs. Cuauhtemoc is an Aztec name, and Cuauhtemoc, all of you know of Montezuma, right? And you know of Montezuma's revenge. Well, the Cuauhtemoc was actually the last Aztec emperor, because the Spaniards, the conquistadores, killed Montezuma, killed the next succeeding chief, and Cuauhtemoc was the last Aztec emperor that was captured by the conquistadores. And so these gentlemen, and so in Mexican history, Cuauhtemoc is revered very highly. And so these gentlemen named their team after Cuauhtemoc. Oh, and by the way, they didn't have colored photos back then. I colorized it, so just to give it a little more pop. And then this is Bavariano. Out at the ranchito, you can see the ranchito in the background. And once again, I'm going to read from Mr. Sandate's story, because he just writes such a great history of living at the ranchito. The ranchito was also our playground, at least for the younger kids. On summer days, there was a day-long baseball game going on 6 days a week from sunup to sundown, with breaks only for a quick lunch. The only day off was Sunday, which was reserved for church and family time. Other games included basketball, football, fishing, and swimming in Sand Creek, and playing war at the battleground. Nighttime games included kick the can, Red Rover, hide and seek, and more. When you throw in this mix the occasional rock fight, BB gun fight, bow and arrow fight, and fist fight, it was not surprising that most kids who grew up there were infused with a competitive nature and able to take care of themselves. For a youngster about to leave the nest and start public schools, the Ranchito was a security blanket. Despite the arguments, bickering, and squabbles that were part of our playground, camp kids were protective of each other. Outside of that cocoon, there was a certain identity and impenetrable safety net that others dare not mess with. If you challenged a small, undersized boy in the public schoolyard, there was always a bigger Ranchito, brothers or sisters, there to protect your back. A bully took on a kid from the Ranchito at its own risk. If there was one thing that was a given, is that these brothers and sisters stuck together. So I just love this photo because it just shows how sports was. When you look at the Ranchito, you almost have to realize that it's a community within a community. I think the lady previously was talking about these parallel communities that live within Newton. But the same was with the Ranchito. You know, they had their own teams. They had their own swimming holes. You know, they couldn't swim at the swimming pool, so they swam at Sand Creek. And they just had their adventures there within that community. And then one other thing they had there was music. Now this isn't at the Ranchito, but these guys are called, I was told they were called los cafeteros, meaning the coffee guys or the coffee drinkers. And they're one's from Newton, one's from Florence, one's from Peabody, and I'm not sure what the other one is. But they just loved music so much that they were willing to just go and play at fiestas or at baptisms or at weddings, any kind of different event, and all they would charge was just have the coffee ready for me. That's why they were called los cafeteros. That was their way. And they could jump on the train and go here and there, or jump in a car and go. But that's how they enjoyed playing the music. And at the Ranchito, they had their own dance floor that was put out. Some of the ladies that I have talked to talked about the dance floors that were built there for them to have maybe a Saturday night dance. And so these were the kind of bands that would actually play at those events. Okay, then, so moving on from Newton, Las Casitas at Marfil Glen. Okay, now, it's called Marfil Glen because that's the way the Spanish pronounce Matfield Green. They didn't call it El Ranchito or Las Casitas. Eventually some people named it Las Casitas, but when they were talking about where do you work at, well, no, I work at Marfil Glen. Okay, so this is one of the bunkhouses, the only surviving bunkhouse in Kansas. And there's a great picture of it from May 1930, a Santa Fe photograph. And you can see right there, when they were talking about that kid taking a bath in a tub, in a tina, well, there's a tub right there leaning against that part of the building. And then right in the back, I'll show you later, but that train basically runs within 10 yards all the way behind that. So if you're there in that house, there could be that constant noise and traffic of trains just running by you all the time. And once again, Chris Palacios, once again, one of those other historians that I am so indebted to. You know, this is his drawing because he had family there. This is his drawing of Matfield Green and who lived there and how it was broken down. So just a beautiful recollection of history. And since I was working on the Fiesta in the '90s, like I said, I'd been told that Matfield Green was the last surviving structure of the Mexican camps. So, just one time I was coming back from Victoria, and on a whim, I said, I whipped my car around and headed down Strong City, and headed south to Matfield Green. I also got a speeding ticket, but that's... And then when I got there, because it was on a whim, I didn't have a camera, so I didn't get to take a picture of it. But I ended up going to local stores and said, is there any historian or somebody I could talk to about Matfield Green? And they sent me to a gentleman, and this gentleman had this photo of his class from 1934, 35, and in it there are two Mexican boys. They're Palacios, and if any of you know any of the Palacios from Newton, these are their relatives from way back, the grandfathers of the Palacios from way back. And you can see them, he's in his overalls, or pachetas as they call them. One there on the first row, fifth from the left, and then the third row, second from the right. I mean, that's, you see, fifth from the right and first from the right on third row. You can see those little brown faces is basically what you're looking for. But this is what it looked like. It was in pretty bad shape, but it was still standing. That's the beauty of it, that this ranch was still standing. So these are not my photos. I actually talked to the gentleman that, I'll show you the next part. But they were in pretty derelict condition. Except now, they're an Airbnb. This great gentleman, Bill McBride, a lawyer from Chicago, retired, came down and refurbished it and built this whole complex that you can visit. And you can now rent these as an Airbnb. So he did a beautiful job. The surroundings of it. And then I love this picture too, because it shows you an idea how close that train came by on the backside. And so when you were there, that was a constant traffic. And now think about it, now trains aren't that often, but man, back in the 30s and 40s, the trains were they were constant. That's the way America moved back then. So. And this is what it looks like, cleaned up. You saw that picture earlier where the tub was right here. Well, this is the view of it now. And like I said, each one of these rooms are available for rental through Airbnb. There's the Airbnb Matfield Station if you're interested. And this is what they look like now, not back then. Okay, so there's a big difference. Because only then they would probably just had a potbelly stove. They now have heating and air conditioning, and you can then rent them for a minimum of 2-day stay. So there's one view, and then here's the kitchen view. Kind of gives you an idea about how nice they've been retrofitted. And then I like to do a thing called the archaeologist, because for some reason, we all have this attachment to those memories that were part of our lives. And so, in my case here, because I came here and learned about the Ranchito and the history of the Mexican community, my wife and I ended up doing this painting of what we could consider a typical Mexican railroad family here in Newton. And so, we put some of the things that identify Newton. So there's the train station, there's a Santa Fe train, and then off to the left is the first ranchito and the first church. And if you remember one of those photos with the kids standing in front, that's kind of like, that's where that's taken from. But that kind of helps identify that. And then I'm going to read once again from Mr. Sandate's story, because I think it correlates to this very well. Hard work was the expected commodity at the Ranchito. The men, of course, worked long hours as laborers maintaining the railroad tracks. But then they would come home and toil to maintain their tenement homes, securing fuel for the home potbelly stove hearth, coal or 10-foot railroad ties to be chopped into firewood, and food, planting of sizable off-site gardens to grow corn and other vegetables, or in our dad's case, constructing a large chicken pen and coop to raise chickens for their eggs and meat. The women worked ceaselessly to care for their often large families. Washing clothes under the most primitive conditions was a daily ritual. Preparing and cooking meals was also nonstop. And sewing new or darning old clothes was never ending as well. And the kids, boys and girls, did their share too. Girls helped moms to prepare and cook meals, helped with clothing, washing, and to care for their younger siblings. Boys were in charge of sewing the chopping, then chopping railroad ties into tinder for stoking hard fires, hauling coal for fuel for the hearth, working in the vegetable gardens, and maintaining the chicken coops, which included foraging railroad boxcars to find and secure discarded wheat for feeding the chickens, watering and feeding them daily, and cleaning the coops each week, collecting their eggs, and every weekend dispatching and preparing 1 or 2 hens for Sunday dinner. So they would have a nice fried chicken or chicken and mole. So once again, this art, I'm an art teacher. I got into discovering this history only because of the beauty of the photographs that I saw. And so I consider myself an archaeologist. So here was a painting I did of that. But here's a gentleman, Eli Flores from Wichita. He's like an artist too. He was so enamored of his youth growing up in Valley Center at his ranchito that was almost similar to Newton's ranchito, that he built his own little replica of it that he would show at fiestas and at different places. It just meant that much to him that he had to have it. And they're the same things that he would have had in Newton. There would have been one building for the medical. There's the restroom down at the bottom left, and then there's the housing units. And then he wrote, I now feel I understand my fascination for railroads and the Santa Fe Railroad section house in Valley Center, Kansas. They represented our dad and mom. 7 of my sisters and brothers plus myself were born in that section house. It has always fascinated me, even though back then times were hard for many different reasons. The overall happy memories overshadowed the rough times. That was what it represented to me. So once again, he's one of those archaeologists that talks about, that preserved his history of the ranchitos. And then this is just another view of his. And then he even had a photo showing me originally where it was at. But he was just so touched by that time living at the ranchito that I just thought it was a fascinating little piece of sculpture. To me, it was sculpture, so I saw it at that. And then, if any of you remember the old Chuck's Familia restaurant from way back in the day, well, this is Chuck. This happens to be my wife's uncle. And he was a great pitcher in his time. He was also a great cook. And then he was also a great artist. He grew up in the church, the little one built in 1920, the first Our Lady of Guadalupe on First Street. And he built a replica of it. And this was the one that he built right there that we showed at a Newton Fiesta at Our Lady of Guadalupe one time. And then this is just a side view of it. As he remembered it, Our Lady of Guadalupe, built in 1920, he's written there. And then I add, and then there was the other photos that I showed you earlier. We had this on display at Our Lady of Guadalupe during the fiesta, just to show the historical history of the community. And then I just love this little touch that he did. He said he did the interior view of the church, and in there's a wedding going on. And you can see the bride and the groom, and the organist and the father. He is missing the parishioners, but I still think it's pretty impressive. And he's got the little light on it and whatnot. So just a beautiful touch. Once again, to me, an archaeologist trying to keep that history alive of what endeared him growing up with that church. And then I'm of a railroad family, and I grew up in California. And so I lived in railroad housing too. I lived in two different places. That's my father up there with my older brother and sister, and then my brother John, my older brother. We lived in Mojave Desert, but I don't remember that. I was too young. That's me on the far right. In the far right photo, but I'm on the far left with my younger brother and my sister. That was one camp. It was called Little Lake. We were only one boxcar. And then later, my father was bumped up to Fresno, California. And in Fresno, we lived there till 1960. And there's my mother and the railroad camp, the boxcar that we lived in. And then there's the restroom and the showers. And then this is our interior view of our house. That's me on the middle photo. I'm the one peeking out behind my brothers and sisters. And then on the far right, I'm in the back between my older brother and sister. I got my leg kind of crossed. But that's my sister, Lucy, my brother Robert, my mom, my brother John. He had a broken arm at the time. Then me, and then my sister Elaine. That was our home. So I had that appreciation for these ranchitos and the life that Mr. Sandate talked about. And then the final place was La Yarda, which just technically just means the yard in Spanish. And this is in Lawrence, Kansas. And what they've done is that this was an artist rendition because, once again, just like Newton's, it doesn't exist anymore. And the other thing is that all these camps, you could go to almost any community, Emporia, Kansas City, Ottawa, any kind of Garden City, Dodge City, they all had camps, but they're all gone. And once again, that's why I showed Matfield Green, because it was the one last one. But all these, but they still had those memories for people. And so the one in Lawrence was revered. And this was a watercolor done by Frank Chavez that showed their camp. And you can tell it's the brick units looking very similar to Newton's units. He's going to have his little scale drawings down here showing how the community lived within that, within the confines of their little yard, as they call it, or La Yarda. And then they're documenting their history. Taking a photo of the children in the 1940s. And the young ladies that lived there, some of the young boys, and once again you can see the brick units because the railroad built the same kind of units everywhere, and so here's the same ones, almost I was going to say igual, like the same as in Spanish, the same as in Newton, exactly like Newton's because they would use the same blueprint plans to build the homes as opposed to trying to just build everything different. And then once again, more informal portraits. Here's the young girls there and young kids, and there's the brick units in the back. And then the one on top almost looks to me like Matfield Green's units, but built a little differently. But once again, these photos were collected by the La Yarda group. And they actually worked with the Kansas Humanities Organization, get involved, and they have their stories, places, and a video called Searching for La Yarda. And it's all these descendants of that community that actually do interviews and go back to the old camp, and they have their old photos collected. And they were even doing a reproduction build of one of the homes at the inside. So that's my last photo, but that just gives you an idea of what it was like to have lived in the camps and to have seen, or to share with you those kind of times that were enjoyed by everybody in the camp. And I thank you.
And we're going to prolong this just a little bit. If you have any questions. Yes. And you'll all get a mic, and you'll have to speak directly into it, very close.
A lot of these pictures were from the early 1900s. I'm not clear, maybe I missed it. When did the Mexicans arrive in Newton? Were they here when the Santa Fe Railroad track was first laid in 1871? Were they either that early?
No, not that early. They came later, like in 1905. The early part of the century. They were just still having to maintain the lines, and those early workers were not available anymore. And now the railroad line was running all the way through the Southwest and through the Midwest. They just did not have the manpower. So when they ended up connecting with the railroad tracks in El Paso, that was like, hey, there's tons of Mexican workers there that were willing to bring up. So,
Question here?
Halstead or Burton had a Ranchito, or maybe both towns did, that would be comparable to the one here in Newton. So is there any documentation or research on, was it only one or both towns?
I would think,
Halstead and Burton?
I mean, it was surprising, almost any time. Somebody could make a career out of just trying to go through each little town and digging up the stories and the history. I sadly regret that Charlie Triggs, because I taught with him, he a fellow teacher at Newton High School, one time just came up to me, he goes, hey Ray, we need to go up to Cedar Point, Ray, I need to go show you where the railroad camp used to be. And we just had, and then I said, we go have a dinner and stuff. But I never followed up. We just never got together, finished that. And that's an example of like all these little places. Another time, my wife had her dance troupe dance in Harrington, Kansas. And as they were dancing, this is probably 20 years ago, I didn't consider it, I didn't see how it was a Mexican town, but as they were dancing, an elderly gentleman, I would say a Mexican gentleman, probably in his 80s, came up out of the crowd. And I went over to talk to him and just asked him, like, you seem out of place here. And he goes, well, no, I grew up here because my father worked on the railroad and this is where I'm from. It just seemed so out of place, but that was the spur that it had. Oh, one other thing about who worked in Kansas. So when I was going to paint that mural, the way it worked out is my wife came back here, got the go-ahead to paint the mural, then she sent me the check, and I had to go back to San Francisco and buy the mural paints and then drive here to paint the mural. Well, on the way back, I stopped at my grandfather's house, because he happened to be back on the way. And I stopped off to see him because I hadn't seen him in a while, and he was in his 80s, if not 90s. And I just wanted to tell him, sounds good, Grandpa. You know what, Grandpa? I'm going to Kansas. I wanted to kind of impress him that I was going to Kansas. And then his eyes lit up, and he goes, and he tells me in Spanish, I've been to Kansas. I go, what? And he goes, yeah. I said, I'm going to Newton, Kansas. And then, once again in Spanish, he said, me acuerdo, Newton, Emporia, Kansas City. He said, I remember working in Newton, Emporia, Kansas City. He said he worked all the way up to Chicago and then went back. So in my research of all this history, the railroad, on average, probably lost about 90% of their labor that came and worked. 90% went away. But the 10% that stayed, that's like my wife's family, Mr. Ariano's family, all those families that stayed at the Ranchito, those were the ones that became those little islands of camps and Casitas and the Ranchitos. They stayed. And so when I said, I don't I didn't know there was Mexicans in Kansas. There were.
You referenced the use of railroad ties several times, both in the construction of the first iteration of these ranchitos as well as using them for fuel, for heating stoves. Has there been any study done of the long-term effect of creosote?
I don't think so. I know that I've seen these commercials on, what is it that, lately I've seen commercials on TV if you worked in a certain industry and you cause cancer, but I don't think they basically gave a damn about them back then, and so that was just one of the hazards of work. One of the other things that came about from things like that, though, when you talk about that when I'm saying they didn't really care about them, is that those Mexican camps became, they had to like organize themselves, and so one way they organized themselves is they created their own mutual societies, and these mutual societies would help pay for widows, for burials, or for the bodies to maybe get sent back to Mexico, because maybe the railroad would give them up partly some, or not even really pay them, depending on how they died. And so these mutual societies would take care of them. And then they weren't always welcome to be buried here. If you go to St. Mary's Church, St. Mary's Cemetery on the east side, past the drive-through, on the very far end, that's where the first Mexicans that died and were buried here. They weren't even allowed to be buried in the main part of the cemetery. So those old burial plots go way back when they said, okay, we'll bury you here, but you're gonna be buried there at the end. So.
Thank you for presenting today. Most of us, or several of us, are probably aware of the residencies on West First Street, but where was the first encampment?
It's, here's another one of my, Russ Cuellar had told me one time, he goes, Raymond, man, I need to show you where the first camp is. And I had gotten photos from him and stuff like that. We were always talking about history. And I go, yeah, Russ, we need to do that, man. I'd love to see where the first camp is. Supposedly, it was across Sand Creek, south of the tracks, and that's all I know. And Chris Palacios has drawn a little drawing of it, but I still do not know definitively where it was at. But it was in walking distance. There was a bridge over the tracks that the parishioners could come from the camp to the church. So it really was probably within a half mile to a mile within that vicinity. Yeah, just a little, on the branch line going to Wichita. So I just hate myself for, I should have just had him, hey, just draw it for me, Russ. And it was just one of those things that, to this day, I regret that I didn't get the location of it. Even though I have hints of it, of where it's at, but not exactly.
This isn't actually a question. Do I need to get it closer?
No, fine.
As close as you can get.
This isn't a question, but it's an observation that the camaraderie among them and willingness to take care of each other in those small groups must have been what kept them going. And they weren't, I don't hear of a lot of fighting among the group. They were just working together. It seems like, I just...
Yeah, that's what he was talking about as children, we have the regular tussles and fights, but we still got along, and we stood up for each other when it came time if we were getting harassed or bullied at school. So.
Closer. Is there a book available with this information?
Not yet. It's always been a thing that I'm working on a book chapter for the baseball in Kansas, and some of these things will be included in that. So.
I got one. Ray, have you ever researched all the little towns along the old Highway 50 going to Emporia, where a lot of the camps used to be?
No, that's what I'm saying, that could be a career in itself, to just go through and find. And that's what I mean about Charlie Trigg said, hey, Raymond, I want to show you where that little camp was. I'm like, hey, Charlie, I'd love to do that, but, it just never happened. And then sadly, Charlie passed away last year or so. And then, so every time I drive by Cedar Point, man, I just feel bad. And I've driven through Cedar Point too. I get off there, I just want to check this little town out, what is it? But no, I mean, there's so many other stories out there.
Other questions? Last chance. What a fascinating presentation, really. Just fascinating. Please give me